My name is Drew Clark, and I am the editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. We welcome you to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, September 15th, 2021. It's hard to believe that it's been a year and a half since the onset of the pandemic as we know it and understand it. That's why we started doing this weekly webcast, Broadband Breakfast Live Online, to bring this community together at this time, talk about the solutions that broadband can offer. We at Broadband Breakfast believe in better broadband, better lives. That's our mantra and our motto. And so we're about the infrastructure, but also how it is used, how it plays a role in people's lives, what we can learn by studying that role, as well as the impact of broadband writ large on technology, the technology ecosystem, social media, and the controversies that we see around that. Before I introduce our two guests for this wonderful conversation we hope to have this hour, I want to just say a little bit about the past, the present, and the future. Okay, and so the past is that we take our name, Broadband Breakfast, from a breakfast series that we launched, the Broadband Breakfast Club, years ago here in Washington, D.C. And it's been some time since we can meet in person, but we have started it. We have actually, as of last week, met in person, and many of you who are on this live stream perhaps had a chance to watch, because we're not only meeting in person, we are also meeting online. So it's now Broadband Breakfast for lunch. And you can register and attend. The next one we'll do one a month. October we'll do another one. And we just wanted to kind of remind you that we're now both online and in person. And so we hope that will kind of be a model. It's going to have to be a model, because there's just so many complications, so many people, even though most of Americans are vaccinated, that we are 62%, 63%. Last I checked the numbers, but not as high as some of us would like to see, so that we get over this hump as best we can. So that's the past, leading into the future. The present is we are going to have a great discussion, is my hope here, with two very exceptional experts on broadband and broadband surveys and broadband research, and I will introduce them just now. But they are here because Broadband Now is going to be releasing a survey at the future event that we're going to have, which is digital infrastructure investment, that's taking place in 12 days on September 27th. It's going to be in Houston with the Broadband Community Summit, but we are also going to do it online, live online as well as in person, kind of matching what we've just talked about, doing the hybrid style, where those of you who are not able, for whatever reason, to make it to Houston to attend Broadband Communities will be able to register, sign up, and come to the conference. It's $149 to join online. It is $349 is the best rate you can get through membership in Broadband Breakfast Club to attend the Broadband Community Summit in person. I'll be there. I'll be in Houston in person. But again, we understand many of you may not be able to make it there. And so if you are interested in attending the digital infrastructure investment, we do look forward to seeing you there. And we're going to preview with the moderators for the program next week. So next Wednesday at this time, we're going to have the moderators for each of the digital infrastructure investment sessions to preview what is to come just a week from then. All right, that is enough of the wind-up. I want to now open it up to our two guests. They are John Busby. John is with Broadband Now. He's the managing director. Broadband Now has really established itself as the place to go with up-to-date data about broadband availability, the companies that offer broadband service. He can tell more about how they do it, but they've been integrating some of the data that was first made available through the National Broadband Map, but they do additional data integration, and they also do a lot of research, and that's really what we're going to be talking about here today. And John Busby will be followed by John Horgan. John and I have known each other for a decade and a half, if not longer. John is senior fellow at the Benton Institute on Broadband and Society, and he focuses on technology adoption and digital inclusion. And he has also served as Associate Director of Research at the Pew Research Center and a senior fellow at the Technology Policy Institute. When I think of broadband surveys, John is just the absolute expert, the dean of broadband surveys. They started that at Pew Research Center, and maybe he'll tell us just a little bit about the origin, genesis, and history of that, as well as the way his research interests are taking him right now. So with that, let's go ahead and open it up. We're going to start with John Busby. Tell us a little bit about Broadband Now, the research you do at Broadband Now, and what you are hoping to accomplish with this new broadband survey. Go ahead and unmute yourself so we can all hear you. Great.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks for the tee up and the introduction. Great to be here talking with you and John. This morning for me, I'm in Seattle. You can probably see I'm in my home office. It's not a nuclear bunker. It's actually my attic. Like many of us all have had to shift where I work over the last 12 to 18 months. So yes, we are launching a survey in 2 weeks at the Digital Infrastructure Investment Summit. What I thought I'd do, I actually was a go-getter. I created a couple of slides just to describe Broadband Now, and then also I'd like to go through the survey and get feedback from the audience. If not now, then after John speaks. So let me share my screen. Okay, let's see. Thumbs up, Drew. Can you see this?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, great. So, so Broadband Now, we're a data resource for consumers, policymakers, and research about internet service in America and the digital divide. Drew's and Broadband Breakfast mission is better broadband, better lives. We believe that all Americans should have access to broadband internet, and our own estimates are that 42 million Americans do not. There are really two things that we do. One is we have a service for consumers to check all the local internet service providers in their area by entering a zip code. And then we also have a robust research section on the site that estimates the digital divide, talks about the digital divide, and does a bunch of research. Our roots are not, I'm going to talk about the survey, but our roots are not really in the type of survey that we're unveiling. Our roots are in data collection, and I want to describe where our data comes from because I think it'll help a little later on in the conversation. So our base data at Broadband Now comes from the FCC Form 477, where, as everyone on the call probably knows, internet service providers share their coverage down to the census block a couple times a year. So there's some flaws with that. I think as folks know, it doesn't go down to the household, just the census block. So what do? We, first of all, our coverage data is enhanced by several hundred providers who submit updates to us directly. FCC Form 477 data is usually 12 to 18 months old, so we have more current data. Then what we do is we manually collect plan pricing and coverage data for all ISPs in the United States every single month. And we've done this now for 6 years. So that allows us to study not just where providers are, but also affordability and speeds offered. We manually audit FCC data for more than 50,000 households, meaning we take all the households in the US, randomly select 50,000, use FCC data to tell us which provider should be there, then actually go to the providers and see if we can actually get service. And that's a really useful to coming up with our estimate for the digital divide. And then finally, we take publicly available speed test data from MLabs, and then we associate and overlay that with provider technology and location. So why is this important? Here are two zip codes. I'm gonna actually, let's see if I can draw. This zip code here, 98144, this is a zip code in Seattle in which I live. And then when you alphabetize all the counties and states, this this one shows up at the top of the list. It's Atauga, if I'm pronouncing it right, in Alabama. And if you go down here to the bottom of this table, you can see the number of providers in 2015, the number of wired providers, and then down here where it says 4, where I lived in 2015, there were 4 providers that offered high-speed or broadband service. In 2015, there weren't any in Atauga. Now, fast forward to when we pulled this data, which is in 2020, there's been progress in my zip code, but not in Alabama. This is really the crux of the issue. So Broadband Now, we focus on data. We have a data set, but what are we really missing? When I'm in conversations like this, or talking with officials at state governments, or on a panel about how to close the digital divide, there isn't a lot of agreement around how to solve for X, how to address digital equity in Seattle, or the digital divide in rural Florida. There isn't much agreement. Second, there are a lot of opinions about the impact of 5G, low Earth orbit satellites, federal grants, state broadband offices, mapping initiative, municipal broadband. There are all these potential solutions, but I personally don't have a clear picture on what's going to work best in each case to close the digital divide. And then, so
John,
did I lose everybody?
we can still hear you, but your screen got unshared. So I don't know what happened. We're all still here.
Okay.
Why don't you go ahead and share your screen again, because it seemed to be you were right at a good point there, John.
Oh, thanks. I was actually just going to tee up the survey. So because there are all these questions about what we do next, we imagined a survey among broadband leaders to give a pulse for how we think broadband infrastructure is going. And I'll share the survey in a moment here. It'll just be on a different screen. 1 second. And when Drew and I were talking about this survey, I was trying to describe like what we would call the survey. And the analogy I thought of is that the University of Michigan does this consumer confidence survey about shoppers, and I was thinking we need some type of confidence survey among leaders within that touch broadband infrastructure in some way. So I'm going to preview the survey, then pass the mic over to Drew and John. And then later on, if anyone has any feedback on how to improve this survey, I would love to hear it. But the first idea is for the survey respondent to describe in what part of the ecosystem do they work. They work for an ISP in the government, equipment or hardware, the investors, they work in a think tank, and then to rate the US in terms of overall quality of broadband infrastructure. And then the rest of the survey is about different types of initiatives that are meant to address the digital divide in some way, and get some opinions and survey about whether or not people have confidence these will have impact. So the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, the Biden administration's infrastructure package, municipal broadband, the collection of broadband data, 5G, mergers and acquisitions in the broadband industry, low Earth orbit satellite internet, cellular connectivity. So we want to get a pulse for everybody's level of confidence in these various initiatives, and then also some free-form answers about optimism and pessimism with respect to connectivity in America. If the survey is successful, we imagine doing a pulse survey every 3 to 6 months, and then also diving deeper and hopefully sharing all of this information to help policymakers and really everybody involved in addressing this issue on where to go next.
John, would it be okay if I just asked you to repeat what, if you don't mind sharing your screen again? Sometimes it's always good to just hear something twice. So for all of our audience, for me too, just read the core of those questions again. Exactly. So would you take another 30 seconds to summarize these again?
Yeah, I'm on cup of coffee number 3 this morning, so I'm probably going through things at 1,000 miles an hour. So first, we want to understand from survey respondents what part of the broadband ecosystem are they in. So work for an ISP, work for a government entity, work within supply, distribution, installation, involved in investment, or think tank or similar organization. That's what we want to understand first. Then we'd like everybody's opinion as to the overall quality of broadband infrastructure in the US. And we deliberately sort of made this more vague, not comparing to another country or anything like that, just to get everyone's overall feeling as to the quality. From there, we want to dive a little bit deeper to talk about initiatives meant to potentially address the digital divide or digital equity, and get each constituent's opinion on whether or not they will have impact. So the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, what's everyone's opinion on whether that will help close the digital divide over the next decade? The Biden administration's initiatives. Question number 5 is about municipal broadband, and cities and municipalities create their own broadband networks. What role will this have in closing the digital divide? The collection of broadband data. At BroadbandNow, we've been very critical of how it's been collected, but there are a bunch of new mapping initiatives. Are we optimistic about this? 5G and cellular proliferation. There's some debate about whether or not this will truly help things in rural areas. Potential changes and shifts within the broadband industry through mergers and acquisitions. As everyone probably knows, Starlink, SpaceX's Starlink is in beta. It's a low Earth orbit satellite internet product, which is intended to provide low latency, high speed internet. How confident are constituents with that? Cellular connectivity, and then finally a free-form answer on optimism and pessimism. So would love feedback from everyone as to whether or not we're asking the right questions and what we can or should add or remove.
Great. No, thank you very much. I think it's useful just to take another moment to go back over it, to review where we're going with this and how you see it playing out. So let's kind of hold questions, and we may have an opportunity to kind of turn it open it up to our audience on Zoom, at least for questions and answers here in a little bit. But let's get some perspective on this from John Horrigan. A lot we could talk about. Why don't you just tell a little bit about the sort of the history of the different forms of survey research in the broadband space that you've been familiar with, John?
Sure, happy to do that. Andrew, thanks for the invitation to be part of this today. Wonderful to reconnect. And to John Busby, that sounds like a very interesting survey. And the notion of doing sort of a consumer confidence type measure among broadband experts, I think will be a real contribution to policymakers as the plan for millions or billions of dollars of investment unfold over the next couple of years. I've come at the question of surveys on broadband from a somewhat different angle over the years. In the past, I have served as an associate director for research at the Pew Research Center. So I started there in around 2000, 2001. And the goal of what we did at the Pew Research Center back then was just try to understand the role of the internet in people's lives. We weren't particularly focused at the time on broadband, which was a fairly nascent consumer technology at that point. We were broadly focusing on what the internet means to people's social lives, how they consume information, how they engage with civic matters. I started asking questions in around 2003 or 4 at Pew on broadband and how and whether having a high-speed internet connection at home changed people's internet behavior. You could actually back then compare, 40% of your sample had high-speed connectivity, 40% still had dial-up, and you could compare behavioral responses based on technology. And unsurprisingly, certainly now looking back in hindsight, it's not surprising that people with always-on high-speed connections circa 2005 did a lot more online than people who had just clunky old dial-up. Over time, I started to look at the digital divide, and what John described is a focus on the digital divide at Broadband Now, which incidentally is a great resource for consumers, for researchers. I go to that page all the time. Broadband Now is focusing on the component of the digital divide that has to do with network deployment. Do households have broadband speeds serving where they live? And if so, as his slide number 2 or 3 said, how many providers and at what speed? Crucially important. I've tended to focus on the other component or another component of the digital divide, which is the decision to subscribe to broadband. For instance, I live in Baltimore City, and in Baltimore City, we have Comcast as a principal cable modem internet service provider. It covers the entire city. At the same time, we know from American Community Survey data that something like 60% of Baltimore City households subscribe to a wireline broadband service. So there's a large number of households who have, a pretty good broadband connection available to them via Comcast, but who choose not to subscribe. A lot of those households have smartphones and cellular data plans, but research shows that relying only on that kind of online access is a constraint for doing schoolwork online for students or doing work at home and that sort of thing. So I've tended to focus on the other question, which policymakers care about. And I think the pandemic has put sort of both parts of the digital divide into very clear focus for policymakers. They know that some people don't have networks or very good networks. They know a lot of people don't subscribe for a host of reasons. Affordability of service tends to top the list when you look at survey research. And so going to John's slide that said, how do I solve for X? The fact is, and I don't want to get into algebra from high school or something like that, but we have multiple variables that we're wanting to solve for in sort of a simultaneous equation sort of way. You want to get better networks to more places, but it's the case that if you get better networks to places that don't have them, which tend to be rural areas, you're still going to have households who don't subscribe because maybe they can't afford it. And then you have to start to understand what interventions help people overcome the barriers they face in terms of subscribing to broadband. And there's a lot of research out there, some of which I've done, that goes to that issue and also goes to the impact of getting service to people's households. And so again, that means getting better networks to them. And that also means getting them the resources to help them subscribe if they might have difficulties affording it. And one thing that's different now than say 10 years ago when I was working on these issues at the Federal Communications Commission for the National Broadband Plan is that we have a greater body of evidence as to what interventions help people get online and how that makes a difference in their lives. Something I can put in the chat or otherwise make available to you all later is some work I did that came out a few months ago that tries to understand what the impact is on households who recently get connectivity via discount internet offers. I was able to survey recent Comcast Internet Essentials subscribers and try to hone in on what difference it made for them to get broadband at home. And I'll quickly summarize this, there were really two kinds of impacts that come out of that research. One is what we called the access effect. 81% of recent broadband subscribers in the survey I did of Internet Essentials subscribers said that having high-speed connectivity via Internet Essentials helped them a lot in carrying out online activities. Most, if not all, of the respondents had smartphones, so they had some kind of connectivity, but having that consistent wireline broadband access made a huge difference in their perceptions on how effective they were in carrying out things online. The second thing we asked people to do was to rate how they view their lives and how do they view their lives 5 years from now. There's a good amount of social science that shows that if people rate their lives in a positive way, they actually take steps to improve their lives in terms of getting better jobs and having a better earning potential. And we found, in fact, that having high-speed connectivity in this sample made a positive impact on people's perspectives on where their lives are today and where their lives will be in 5 years. So that helps convey the idea to policymakers that getting connectivity to people, if, for instance, you subsidize service so that they can better afford broadband, will have payoffs in the future in terms of people taking steps to improve their lives. So I think what John's survey and Broadband Now's survey promises for policymakers is a sense of how leaders in the industry think it's going in terms of possible solutions. I think the question about does satellite and solutions like SpaceX seem to have promise are really tremendous to have for policymakers. Same with 5G as a possible solution. They tend to be the bright, shiny things that get a lot of attention, but to translate people's perceptions about the technology into whether they are in fact promising for closing digital divides would be a crucial contribution for policymakers. The research I've done shows that, and others have done, show that the cell phone and the smartphone as the principal tool for getting online, as wonderful as it is for everybody, has limits in terms of carrying out certain online tasks. The robust wireline solution that's available today in many places has a measurable positive impact on people's perceptions on whether they can carry out things online that matter to them. So I think between Broadband Now's survey and what we have learned from research on how having access impacts people's lives, and it's a lot of it's my research. There are other research findings that support this notion, can really help policymakers start to have kind of an end-to-end understanding of how to solve for X and how to solve for Y as well. X being network deployment and Y being the adoption decision at home. So with that, I'll turn it back to Drew, and we can, I hope, have a discussion of what Broadband Now is up to, which I think is really going to be valuable to stakeholders.
Two quick questions. First for John Horgan, and for those watching in other streams, we have put we have the links to John's research on the page for this event, so you can find it there. Could you just make a reference to I guess I kind of have embedded in my brain the threefold reasons for lack of adoption of broadband, if I'm recalling correctly: availability, price, and relevance. Could you just elucidate on that? Where did those kind of come from, and has there been any change in the way you and others view those significant those types?
Yeah, from the National Broadband Plan 10 years ago, a specific bit of work that we focused on was what are the barriers to broadband adoption? And we did a national survey at the time, and we found that there were three buckets. One was affordability. which would include the monthly access fee and the cost of a computer. The other was digital skills, whether people felt confident in using the internet and computers. And then the third was relevance. There were a number of people who said in the survey that having service just wasn't relevant to them. And so that was the order of impact. Affordability, number one, and then in roughly equal measure, secondarily, were relevance and digital skills. Over time, that has changed. Relevance has receded in importance for those who don't have broadband, and affordability has increased. And that kind of makes sense. In 2010, when we did the survey, you had large number of Americans not online with broadband, meaning that a lot of people who didn't have service, might cite reasons like, I just don't want it. It's also the case in 2010, there were more offline alternatives for all sorts of things than there are today. When you move 10 years forward, we've seen a steady increase in broadband adoption over those years, meaning that remaining offline folks without broadband at home are the hardest to reach. So they don't have broadband because they can't afford it or the computer's too expensive. Digital skills still is an issue that has risen in importance. Within the subset of digital skills worries is trust in people's data and personal information online. That's particularly important for older offline adults. And relevance has receded in part because there are fewer offline alternatives today, and the pandemic has really shone a light on that. So there's still those three buckets, but the relative importance has changed, with affordability still being sort of the anchor reason as to why people don't have service at home, and digital skills and trust coming in second, and relevance, as I said, has receded in importance.
Oh, thank you for that. And this second question hopefully will bring us both into this conversation. That is, like, what are the resources and surveys and the institutions that are doing them? For example, was there not a question on the census, or at least the home? And forgive me for remembering the name of the survey research that there were some broadband questions added to. Could you just describe the landscape briefly, John Horgan, as to who's doing what kinds of surveys on this topic right now?
Sure. Well, today, the Pew Research Center continues to do very good survey research that captures nationally, not only what's going on with broadband adoption, but people's views on how it's performed during the pandemic, for instance, and how the internet's been playing a larger role in people's lives. Pew put out something just within the past week, I think, on that. But very importantly, since 2010, the federal government has gotten much more involved in surveys that help people understand what's going on at the city level, state level, county level, with reasonably good levels of granularity. That's the American Community Survey, which is a large-scale yearly survey that Census conducts. And they have questions that I think are pretty good questions to capture wireline broadband adoption, smartphone adoption, computer adoption, subscriptions to data plans. And the sample size for the ACS is large enough so that you can do analysis, for instance, on what's going on in your town, as long as your town is over 65,000 in population. So I referenced a number from Baltimore City. That came from the American Community Survey, which helps stakeholders understand what's going on in their community. So that's very important resource that's in existence now that wasn't a decade ago.
Great. Well, they're great. Those are great lead-ins now to John. And you described John Busby earlier in the conversation when you were talking about the data research that Broadband Now uses. You did talk about these I don't know if surveys is the right word. You call people up to check on certain things. Talk a little bit about that. Your experience with that, John. But really, kind of lean into the future. What you'd like, who you'd like to be responding to this survey, and kind of what your hopes are coming out of it.
Well, in terms of what we do with the households each year is once we collect a we have a huge database of addresses. We randomly select 50,000, and then we use the online tools of internet service providers to try to sign up for service at that address. And many providers will just tell you whether or not service is offered. And so we use the FCC data as the quote unquote source of truth as to what should be available, and then we audit that. And I'm curious, John Horgan, about availability. And do you have any evidence among people that want to sign up for Internet Essentials but have difficulties doing it? I'll just give a couple of examples. One is it can be, if you don't have a good internet connection, it can be difficult to sign up for Internet Essentials on your phone. Second, typically most addresses have had like a cable subscription in the past, which makes signing up for Internet Essentials kind of challenging. I don't know if you've gone through the sign up process. And then there's also issues like even though my apartment building may technically be able to get X, Y, or Z provider, there's a challenge with the wiring, or my apartment's never been hooked up or anything like that, which just create these barriers where someone might say, I give up.
Let me make sure I'm, yeah, you see me rustling through papers because I actually have some data on that question. And this also gives me a chance to tee up the fact that an entire survey report will be coming out in the coming months that reference the data I'm about to talk about. So I'm just going to give you a little preview. So in conjunction with the nonprofit Everyone On, we did a national survey of low-income households on a host of questions about their internet use, specifically during the pandemic. But we also asked people who do not have broadband at home why they do not have broadband at home. And we asked about this question of internet service at your residence. And so this is a sample of households whose annual incomes are below $50,000 per year. So that's on the lower end of the median, that's below the median income nationally. And so 20% of non-broadband users said they could not get internet service installed at their residence. Now, that could, John Busby, go to the question about the wiring in the building is lousy, and so I can't get service. I have yet to look at this breakout by geography to see if there's a difference in response rate by or response by rural versus urban. So you do get a chunk of non-adopters saying that that's a problem. We actually do a two-step process. We ask, is this a reason that you would say you don't have service? And then part two of the question is, well, what's the most important reason? And 6% of respondents said the most important reason was they couldn't get internet service installed at their residence. So, that's an important finding, and it goes to the fact that deployment is an issue for people who don't have broadband.
John, does that address John Busby, does that address that question? What's the takeaway from that for you as you're thinking about kind of tapping into this question of people who are not online or not online sort of in the more conventional kind of heavy users of broadband? How do we kind of get them into a better broadband situation? And there's sort of some challenges in getting that data, right? Is that kind of that part of the question, John Busby?
Yeah. If there's a segment of the population that has lower digital literacy and also challenges with wiring at the residence, or just what are the barriers to actually signing up? I'm interested in that, outside of whether or not broadband is like technically deployed in the census block or in the area. But Drew, zooming out and asking about your question, I loved how John Horgan frames the issue from a consumer perspective: availability, price, and relevance. And then I'm interested in this survey, I think, is interested in finding out from the actors who would solve this problem, whether it's availability, price, or relevance, how optimistic are each of them about these policies or initiatives that are intended to address them. And we imagine the first version of this survey is going to be a pulse check. And then from there, and that's why we have some free form answers. We can have a second version of the survey, probably at the beginning of next year, that unpacks this a little bit more and can be used by organizations to help help advise policymakers on what to do next.
So, John, obviously, feel free to react to that. But what is your take on the consumer confidence style of survey, right? And feel free to, if you are familiar with the, I guess, University of Michigan, is that right? Survey, and what it does, how it does it, how that might be different from other survey research instruments, John Horgan.
Well, in terms of what Broadband Now is doing, if I understand it correctly, it's taking the pulse of experts in the field on different possible solutions to the digital divide. And I think it's crucially important to understand those leaders' attitudes towards the probability of success, which is essentially what you're trying to capture over time. And I think it will be important to see how that changes over time. And you would certainly expect it to, because there are, hundreds of millions of dollars about to be released to the ecosystem to help solve the problem. And so if I'm a decision maker, and what I think the survey can help do is, in a sense, help stakeholders prioritize action, which is to say, and I'll take my experience in Baltimore, and it's happening in a lot of communities, an influx of money from the feds for pandemic relief, a lot of it at the discretion of states and localities on how to allocate, not only within broadband buckets, but across all sorts of different areas important in society. So am I going to allocate that funding to broadband or to repairing or upgrading the sewage system in the city? The answer to that's going to vary by a lot of different variables that we don't know about. But, sewer systems have been around for a long time. Local governments taking a pass at solving broadband problems is pretty new. So if you don't know whether there's a probability of success, you're going to hesitate to allocate funding into the broadband bucket and put the money elsewhere. If you get findings from the Broadband Now survey that suggests that there is a level of optimism about the capacity for industry to solve these problems, if you tether those findings with research that I and a lot of other people do on not just what the payoffs are of broadband investments, but what are the right approaches to allocating those funds effectively, you start to allow give decision makers just a better set of facts on which to make their decisions. So I think that's what is really exciting about this survey.
And what about survey? How about confidence surveys? What is being measured in the University of Michigan, confidence about the economy, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. That as consumers, we all are making choices about what to buy and when to buy it. And for big ticket items, we way through things related to our, household income in the future and whether I'm going to be able to pay off that car loan over 5 years or something like that. So those survey questions are directed at consumers, the decision makers, on whether it makes sense to make a big expenditure. So it's a sensible survey, right? You're asking the people who have a stake in the set of questions you're asking about their views on it, and they're therefore relevant and answerable to the respondent. The same thing is going on here with the Broadband Now survey. You're asking, if I asked my cousin who doesn't care about broadband in particular about whether SpaceX satellite is going to solve the digital divide, he'd give a thoughtful response, but it really would not be an informed response. I don't really want to ask him that question because his answer really doesn't matter to me. I'm certain my cousin is not on this call. But you're asking people in the industry, people who work in the industry, who are involved in it in some fashion, about their assessment of the probability of action X having an impact on solving the problem. You're asking people who actually have an informed opinion about the issue, what they think about it, and that's valuable, and that's a sensible kind of survey to conduct.
So, John Busby, feel free to react to that. Let me frame maybe another way to approach this that I love your thoughts on for this discussion, which is, are you more interested in that kind of gut response from assuming this is the right universe, the universe of informed people? Do you want their kind of gut response, their emotional, hey, yeah, I'm confident these broadband will work, that there'll be improvement? Or do you want to kind of get in and get answers on those detailed questions like the satellite or the 5G or the particular muni broadband way? I mean, what is your kind of sense as to kind of the gut versus the specifics that you're looking to accomplish from the survey?
One thing I'm really interested in is if there's a gap in confidence among stakeholders. For example, our policymakers or legislators have more or less confidence than others in the ecosystem. And then also, if certain types of solutions, there's more optimism around, or even more awareness. Does everybody know about RDOF or SpaceX or whatever? So I don't think there's really good data about that right now. So that's why we're hoping to collect this as a phase one.
Great response. And I'm curious if you want to kind of come back to that list of 10 questions you sort of raced through at the start, right? I mean, there were some that I'm thinking of, remembering kind of that were sort of specifics, if you will, right? Like, okay, well, what do you think is going to come from RDOF? What do you think is going to come from Muni Broadband? What do you think is going to come from the federal broadband investment? Or maybe this is a question for John Horgan too. How does that translate? Like, how do the answers that you're getting translate into meaningful results? I'm sure John Horgan's looked through crosstabs galore, right? And so what's the science here? What are you trying to do when you look at all these tabs and these responses? How do you determine what the people are saying as a result of the feedback they're giving on these series of questions? Let's go John Horgan, then John Busby.
Well, I'm not sure if this answers your question, but for instance, in the Broadband Now survey, you'll be able to tell whether the person responding is a government official or works in the governmental sphere. Then you'll also be able to identify whether the respondent is somebody who works in industry. As John Busby, I think, was alluding to understand the levels of, or just what the responses are, the differences in responses for those two groups could be illuminating. It certainly would be illuminating. So for instance, and I'll put a bias on the table, I like to say not so great things about 5G's role in closing the digital divide. In part because it's a very expensive infrastructure investment, and just from a business case perspective, that kind of investment tends to go to places where there's disposable income to recoup the investment, and those aren't the poor areas where there are low subscription rates in the United States. Nothing wrong with 5G investment patterns unfolding that way, that's the business case, but to link it 5G to as a potential solution to digital divide, I'm a little skeptical about. Yet there are tweets, panels, and writings that suggest that that is the case, that 5G can solve the digital divide. So given that, what's the differential response rates among industry versus governmental types on that question? And given my perspective on 5G, even if you have a very different perspective on 5G's role in closing the digital divide, which I'm sure many people do, to have that as sort of as a hypothesis to go into analyzing the Broadband Now data is important. And the fact that you can analyze the data results across whether somebody's governmental in the governmental sphere or in the private sector is important, and I would think would be illuminating to people trying to make decisions in this field.
That's certainly our hope, John and Drew, and very excited to see if we can't get a really significant response from the survey. We're going to be publishing it on our site, debuting it at the summit, Drew, and also letting our mailing list know about it. So hopefully we can get thousands of responses and really dive deeper.
Let me raise one or two more questions, and then we'll have kind of closeout thoughts from both of you. One is the global aspect of this, and our conversation today has been very U.S. focused, right? And perhaps understandably so. A lot of the issues are policy issues, but broadband, of course, is about the World Wide Web, connected globally, connecting internationally. I'm just wondering if there's similar reporting, more research, more appropriately academic research, survey research from a global perspective. John Horgan, let's actually start with you as well. What benchmarks do we have when we try to look at, for example, those three elements about affordability, adoption, affordability, relevance, and digital skills? How do those translate into other continents and income levels globally? John Horgan.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I don't have a clear answer on that, except for the fact that there is such a thing called the Oxford Internet Institute, which has done some surveys over the years in the UK on these questions. Ofcom, the British regulator, has in the past at least gotten into some survey work on this. So I do know that in the UK, there's an appreciation for, say, the roles that digital skills play in these issues. In other environments, and again, it depends on where you're talking about in the world, network deployment is the issue, and particularly in developing areas, to try to get networks to people so that they can use the internet. So it does vary quite a bit, but I think there's a little more research done in this country. Well, I should say Esther Hargitay, who's at the University of Zurich, and this should not have slipped my mind for even a moment. Esther does excellent work that measures digital skills, and she does that in a variety of places around the world. So Esther Hargitay at University of Zurich, she also has an affiliation at Northwestern University here, is a good resource on some of those things.
Well, and surprisingly, these questions slipped up on me. We've had in the last 10 minutes. We've got about 3 here. Let's actually pump these out. Doreen Cornwall asks, does your survey ask residents whether they identify as people with disabilities and what accessibility tools they use? Either speaker. John Busby first.
In terms of our consumer surveys that we've done, we haven't asked that question, although we should. Our our focus, though, for this upcoming survey is going to be more for broadband experts.
John Horgan, you referenced, go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, the American Community Survey does ask people about their disability status, so you can compare with some granularity by particular disability type rates of home broadband adoption. They unsurprisingly tend to be lower than for the general population. I have not, however, seen surveys that go to the second part of the question, which is what kind of access tools do people use, which would be a great bit of research to do, but I just haven't seen anything on that myself.
Michael Shear has also asked whether there are questions regarding work from home activities and conditions pre and post COVID. You mentioned the Pew report and you provided a link to that. We can post that on the site for everyone who's watching on other platforms and in the future. But do you want to just summarize the state of research on kind of COVID's impact on broadband? Actually, both John Horgan and John Busby.
I mean, I'll go first quickly. I actually have two bits of research coming out in the next few months on that question. One is a survey that I did for the city of Philadelphia on some of these questions, and the other is a national one that I referenced with everyone on, a national look at low-income populations. And so that'll go through the pre and post-pandemic perspectives of people on how they use the internet. We find that a fair number of households, particularly low-income ones, were having to do a lot, which is to say, many had to upgrade their internet connections, while some had to look for ways to economize on household internet expenses due to the economic disruption. We find that close to 20% of low-income households had an interruption in service due to economic issues during the pandemic. At the same time, we have some numbers that I'm not going to be specific on here that show that households have in fact heard of some of these discount internet offers through their emergency broadband benefit, and they're signing up for it, and that is making a difference in access. A fair number of households have gotten internet through those programs over the past few months. So they've been able to use those resources, those programs, to improve their connectivity for school, for work, for that sort of thing.
John, let's go ahead and hear some final thoughts from you about this question of COVID, pre-COVID and post-COVID research, and how you want to kind of move that issue forward with this survey.
Well, I would just say the work that we did over the last year really showed a difference between the haves and have-nots with respect to broadband internet. There was some concern when COVID started that broadband networks might not be able to handle all of the internet activity. That didn't end up being the case, besides some small network degradation. Most networks held up pretty well as far as our research was concerned, but there was a big impact for folks that didn't have broadband at all. For instance, telehealth, a big challenge, education, a big challenge, those sorts of things. Our survey about how broadband experts feel about the future isn't really a COVID survey per se. I guess my final thought is if you're on the Zoom or watching the live stream and our data can be helpful to you anyway, please reach out to me or to us at Broadband Now. We have a bunch of data available for free and available in an open data way.
We can certainly put whatever contact information you'd like on the page for this event too. And kind of my just closing remarks, and just thanking our guests, which I will in a moment, is to remind you that we are coming up on digital infrastructure investment on September 27th, Monday at 1 o'clock Eastern time. The second link I just sent is for more information about that. We encourage you to participate as we've discussed the sort of unveiling, so to speak, of this, and discussion of this survey by Broadband Now will be part of that program. We want to give a shout out and a thanks to each of our sponsors, and they're listed on the page there. And I want to remind you, we're here every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time. Next week, we'll be previewing digital infrastructure investment. And with that, I want to give a great thanks to John Horgan, who is really the expert on broadband survey research. Really grateful he could join us. And John Busby, the managing director of Broadband Now. Thank you on behalf of John and John. I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next Wednesday at 12 noon. Take care.